in criminal justice reform for a number of years that there may be a little bit of a culture shift, that maybe policymakers are starting to hear the polls and hear people like ourselves, like yourselves, who are out there saying, let's be smart, let's put our money into programs that are going to have a longer term impact. In a lot of ways, Louisiana is still playing catch up a little bit. It's encouraging that we are moving forward, but we have other conservative states like Texas that implemented a lot of these reforms back in 2007, the Carolinas in 2010, Georgia in 2012. So we're still about a decade behind. These other states that have implemented these reforms are seeing double-digit improvements, double-digit reductions in their incarceration rates, double-digit reductions in crime after these reforms go into effect. So I'm encouraged, but also I think we all know that we have to keep at it, even to keep the things that we've gotten in place, let alone anything else that we want to work on.
Right. There's a lot of pressing issues, but I'd love to talk some more around the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, in part because it was so big, right? This was at the 2017 legislature. It was a coalition. It was business. It was, the SPLC, right? It was amalgamation of people that you never thought would talk to each other. And they were all behind the same bills, right? And so because it was such a big moment, let's spend a few minutes just kind of talking about what that was and also what's left to do, right? Because it's not just enough to get a bill passed, right? Because if it's just on paper, is it really creating a difference? What do we see JRI doing in the next year or next few years? So maybe you think you could start us off on that, Tom?
Yeah, I'll start by being a little cynical and then a little enthusiastic. What got us to this point of this great bipartisan coming together of across the aisles, across the industries? We're out of money. There's no money to fund this stuff. So finally, that's the sad thing from from the justice perspective, that we're making decisions based on the fiscal impact. That's not how anybody in this room wants to approach what is right. But that is sometimes the straw that breaks the camel's back. So that's the cynical side. What brought us together finally? Just a little quick background. I know from the State Bar Association, sort of institutional perspective, we had been having meetings and conferences on justice reinvestment since at least 2014, trying to get this idea, working. And I think it wasn't, from at least my perspective, until we were out of money at the state level, that people were really feeling the pressure to actually make a difference and reduce those incarceration rates. So whatever it takes, we're happy that it's happened. So that's the cynical side of what got us there. But the inspiring part, I think, is what we have groups like John's group, Louisianas Prison Alternatives, doing, and maybe I can just pass it over to him to talk a little bit more about what needs to happen going forward.
So maybe, John, could you give us a couple examples of reforms that were achieved through legislation, and then maybe pivot to some of the things that weren't achieved and which maybe we still got to go forward?
Yeah, and with this, the legislation passed. It just didn't pop out of the air, but it was part of a task force that produced a series of recommendations. And then from that, the proverbial sausage was made, went through the legislature, and we all learned a lot. All learned a lot. One of the things from the recommendations, though, and really fueled the coalition that we built, there are a lot of different policies, but a lot of it comes down to, sentencing was important. Basically, with this coalition, we knew that something mattered to everyone, and we wanted to operate in good faith and not, put a lot of weight on what we were doing, and we weren't going to sell anyone out, and we were going to push to be as inclusive as possible. But in the end, we didn't have that decision. We were I like to think of it, one of several tugboats pushing this larger ship out to sea. And one thing that did pass was you extended parole eligibility to people who had committed second-degree murder between 1973 and 79, because back then parole eligibility was available at 40 years. So they got that chance, that opportunity to not die in prison. But part of the recommendations was that Louisiana should have second-degree parole eligibility for second-degree murder, just like every other state except one does. And that was a huge, that was something that was really motivating for a lot of our folks, and it is a part of the mindset that we need to have. We need to be able to forgive, because we also, second-degree murder can be, it's murder. It's not a very pleasant topic, but there are people that served as lookout while didn't know they were even serving as lookout. They were in the car with their older cousin or older brother. They should have the opportunity to go before a parole board and be considered for parole. That didn't happen, and that was part of the sausage-making process that got dropped out for most people. We brought a bill this year which got out of committee, which in most years would be a victory in and of itself. It died quite spectacularly on the Senate floor. We're bringing it back next year. And then if it doesn't pass, we're going to bring it back the year after that. Because I was, in the end, on there for the House Bill 265, watching the voting rights, and that, again, 5 years. Year after year, when is it going to happen? And for us, parole eligibility for second-degree murder is it's an important policy for the people that it affects, but it's also a huge litmus test for Louisiana. Like, are we going to allow ourselves to forgive? Are we going to allow ourselves to move on? Are we going to allow ourselves to say that as a society we actually do believe words like forgiveness and redemption and rehabilitation actually means something? So that drives our coalition. We'll have a lot of other policies, but I think that's the cornerstone.
So JRI did efforts at before people enter the court system. So there's some diversion efforts that are part of the legislation, and then there's some kind of end portions around re-entry, right? But there's another part of this which is around the Louisiana Criminal Code, right? So what do we criminalize, and how do we punish people who are convicted of crimes? And that too was part of JRI. And so I'd like to turn to Kenneth to ask him around, there was one part of JRI, one bill, that set up an entirely new criminal code system, or at least classified the various crimes, but that did not survive in the sausage-making process.
Yes.
So can you help us understand what's going on with Louisiana's criminal code right now and the reform efforts?
So as a compromise, instead of passing that legislation, what was created was a felony class system task force, which I had the honor of serving as the chair for, and many of the individuals who are on the panel were absolutely critical resources in that process. Just to give you a little sense of what we're talking about, we have about 660 plus different felony offenses in the state of Louisiana. Each one of them has its own distinct punishments. It carries its own sentence. It carries its own calculation for good time credit, different calculations for parole or probation eligibility. Essentially an ad hoc system that results in significant lack of visibility and transparency to the system. I can tell you that, and Graham could probably talk a little bit about this, but prosecutors won't be able to even tell the court, defense attorneys won't be able to tell their clients exactly what their exposure will be. There's maybe like one or two people that people have somewhere in the basement of the Department of Corrections that call, and that's the only people in the entire state that can actually calculate this stuff. It is a complete mess. And so what you hope to do is to create a system of classes, whether it's A through D or A through G, that actually gives some consistency, some visibility, some transparency to this system. What I can tell you is this. We had a group of about 12 people that worked through this process over a series of months. We made a fantastic effort at creating a system that in many cases already exists across our sister states. I wanted to read to you a passage really quickly about the cost of having such a disorganized system. It necessarily inhibits rational thinking about the sentencing process. An ad hoc collection of statutes enacted over a long period of time and influenced as to the content and sanctioned more by the political pressures of the moment than by any coherent philosophy of sentencing. So for example, right now as we sit here today, if I robbed one of you right now for $25,000, the max sentence would be $10,000. But if I walked up to you and just took your empty purse off of you, my max sentence would be 20 years, okay? Similarly, across sex offenses, all types of violent offenses, you know, armed robbery carries a 99-year max sentence, but I could fire a gun and actually harm you and be charged with attempted murder, that's 50 years. It just doesn't make sense, right? That passage that I read to you is from the 1962 Model Penal Code. There are 40 states that have already incorporated this. Jonathan talked about how the state of Louisiana is about a decade behind in some cases in terms of reform. We're about 5 decades behind in terms of incorporating an organized system for our felony classes. And right now, we did not have the fortune of having that proposal, our recommendation, incorporated into legislation this session, but we are hoping to see it happen in the next.
Thank you. I mean, it's actually stunning, right? Because Louisiana's criminal code was actually the inspiration for the Model Penal Code.
Right.
Our state was the first to have a comprehensive criminal code in the United States, and now all of the states have left us behind, and we are still working with the system that we had in the 1960s. So JRI, you've learned a little bit about it now, right? And the different components of it. Focusing on kind of this pretrial stuff and then as well this reentry component. But there's a lot of things that JRI didn't even start to address, right? So what our most significant criminal justice reform effort in Louisiana, what it did address is there's a lot of changes that have happened, right? Some of which are still kind of in flux, but we're moving. But there's a whole slew of things that aren't even contemplated or thought of through the JRI framework. And so I wanted to turn to think about, well, what other areas could there be that we could work on that weren't encompassed or touched by the JRI initiative? And so I'd like to start with Graham. So what major issues weren't included in the original legislation in JRI?
It's hard to say that there's like an independent issue that wasn't addressed because all of this is intertwined and it's all interconnected. But you know, Jonathan had said the reason the JRI came into existence and people came together in the first place is because we ran out of funds. I mean, we're spending something to the tune of $700 million a year incarcerating people, and now we're wondering why the state doesn't have money for all these other programs. And the idea is to get people out of jail and then take those savings and reinvest. And that's what we're talking about doing. When I look at what JRI did and what needs to happen in order to get that prison number down further and further and further, I'm looking at not just the transparency associated with the sentencing system, but taking back control of sentencing from the prosecutors who have a, frankly, political motivation to put people in jail for as long as possible, and back into the hands of the judiciary. Not only does the 666 or whatever it is ad hoc statutes and criminal violations make it really difficult to determine, you know, what a sentence is. Not only does it inhibit transparency, and not only do you actually need to call DOC, I think there are 2 people in the basement, and if you call one will give you a different answer than the other, so even they don't know what the answer is in terms of how long somebody's going to be in jail. But it allows, just as an initial step, prosecutors to basically have a broad swath of choices in terms of what they're going to charge someone with. And they can say, well, I'm going to charge you with this armed robbery, and you're facing 99 years, but if you don't bother fighting us, we'll charge you with this offense, and that number goes lower. That kind of overlapping allows that to happen. And some people would say that's fine, okay. But then what we've also done is we've created a system. Everybody's heard of California's 3 strikes rules. We have our own recidivism system. And under our multiple bill system, which is what allows prosecutors to enhance sentences for people who have prior felony convictions, mandatory minimums kick into place. Lack of access to parole comes into place. Lack of access to probation comes into place. And it's not the judge who's making these decisions. It's the prosecutor. And the prosecutor says, oh, 5 years ago you got a drug conviction. So you better take this plea deal now, because if you fight and you lose, the judge doesn't get to look at you and say, you're a nice guy, you made a mistake, I'm giving you probation. He has to put you in jail, and he has to put you in jail for X number of years. And what ends up happening is people who elect to exercise their constitutional right to remain silent and force the DA to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt get punished for it. And they go to jail for much, much, much longer periods of time. We all heard about the guy who, Mr. Noble, had marijuana in his pocket and went to jail for 23 years. That's not the judge. The judge didn't want to do that. Both judges who were on that case, because one judge retired and another one came in, did not want to do that. It was the district attorney who was pushing that issue and putting that man in jail for 23 years. Now, he ended up getting out on parole, which is nice. But that never should have happened in the first place. The multiple bill system needs to be rethought and really needs to be revamped if we are really serious about reducing incarceration rates in Louisiana. And access to probation parole in the first place. When we talk about this ad hoc system, you know, one charge you're allowed probation, another charge you're not allowed probation, mandatory minimums. All of these come into play when we were trying to figure out why we are the incarceration capital of the planet. And our system is really broken. We really need to do more in order to get rid of mandatory minimums, to allow access to probation, parole, to find alternatives to incarceration in the first place if we're really serious about people coming out of the system better than they went in, and putting that discretion back in the hands of a neutral arbiter, a judge, and not a prosecutor who has a political motivation to put people in jail for as long as possible.
So one idea is returning to this role that judges have played, but you mentioned Mr. Noble and his sentence. What I'd like to think about is, Mercedes, what is the experience then of people who are sentenced to 23 years for a joint, and how does that intersect with criminal justice reform?
Yeah, so I'm going to sound like a broken record and just go back to sort of the conditions piece of this, which I think is really valuable. We incarcerate about 50% of the folks that we incarcerate in Louisiana are in state facilities, and about 50% of them are in local jails. And right here in Baton Rouge, you have the deadliest jail in America. That's more deadly than New Orleans. That's more deadly than any other jail in the country. Between 2012 and 2016, there were 25 deaths in the Baton Rouge jail. That's 5 times the national average, okay? And that's from suicide, known risks of suicide. That's from lack of medical care, again, known risks. People have testified in the Metro Council that they don't have enough nurses, that they don't have enough doctors, that it is a dangerous situation. The sheriff knows, everybody knows. And until we push back and demand better for our people who are incarcerated, our fellow citizens who are on the inside, this system is going to continue to perpetuate itself.
Thank you. So how are people landing in these places, Jonathan? So let's, you know, in terms of what JRI didn't address, how does that connect? How are they getting into these spaces to begin with, these dangerous spaces where there's such a likelihood and possibility of future harm?
Well, and one of the things that I think about is what Kenneth started by saying is this idea of pretrial detention. What is forcing people who may not need to be incarcerated, or at least incarcerated pre-trial, into incarceration? Part of that is this risk assessment, and we need to look at whether somebody actually poses a risk to society if they're out, you know, awaiting trial. The other is the financial component of it. We have a bail system, money bail system that basically keeps people who can't afford to pay in jail, or it requires people to come up with the money, possibly putting themselves further into poverty to pay. So we think about, I live in New Orleans, so a lot of my stats and work happens there. But think about a city like New Orleans or in Baton Rouge, where you have extremely high poverty rates. So now you're expecting people, and we know that the vast majority, 60, 70, 80% of people who are facing felony and misdemeanor charges are required to pay money to get out pre-trial. So either those people are, like I said before, are going to be pushed further into poverty in cities like ours where we have such high poverty rates to begin with. There's no way that we can expect people to be able to afford their release. And I think that's part of what is keeping people in jail when they don't need to be. And we know all of the collateral consequences that come from somebody who's spending too much time in jail when they should be out working with their families, pursuing other opportunities. I'm going to double down on our time behind, right? I said we were 10 years behind. Kenneth pointed out we're 50 years behind, but in some ways we're 100 years behind.
Yes,
The amount of time it takes for a defendant to be released is embarrassingly long. When you look at other cities in our country that can deal with a person in that initial part of the justice system within 24, 48, 72 hours. So that's one of the things I think that JRI hints around, but one of the other major issues I think that's going to take some major reform efforts, some major blue shirt efforts, some major advocacy efforts in the next 2 or 3 years to make bail reform the next kind of frontier of justice reform.
Can I ask because obviously we know it's big business, right? I mean, it's a very powerful political, very formative lobbying effort there. How do we work with, if at all possible, how do we get some alignment, some commonality, some common ground with the bail industry around some aspects of reform? Or is it just something that it's us versus them?
Best of thoughts. I know that some folks on this panel are working on studying bail reform, the actual industry itself. Something like 97% of people who post money to be released use a private system, or private bail bondsman. So pretty much everyone has to go to this industry. So, you know, I was in a conversation recently where somebody pointed out that it's not as if these bail bondsmen are all evil people who seek to see people incarcerated or to become wealthy off people's incarceration. It's that the system has been created that has either allowed them to profit or just set up a system in which they've built businesses legally to be part of the system. So I don't know the answer to your question. All I can say is we know that so many people are using the industry that it's going to be difficult to unwind it.
And to be clear, there are jurisdictions where there are no private bail bondsmen.
Right.
And so a judge will set a bail, and that citizen will pay to the court the full amount of that bail, and if they show up to court, they will get that money back. And there is no fee, they are not out of pocket for anything. But in Louisiana, typically, I think it's 11%? Is it 11%?
12.5.
12.5%. You pay a bail bondsman 12.5% of your bond, and that's gone. You never see that again. So there are alternative systems to the system that we have, even if we were to continue to use money bail, which I wouldn't advocate for.
If I could
I
also
thought
say
New
that
Orleans did have moneyless bail.
Yeah,
Jonathan said people use this system, but people use the system because the judges are setting bonds that rely on the system. They know that this person only has $5,000 to give. I can set a $60,000 bond. They'll pay that $5,000, which is what they have, and then the court gets a portion of that money, the DA gets a portion of that money, the public defender gets a portion of that money. Everybody wins, except the person who's being forced to put up the $5,000 in the first place.
It really does intersect in different ways with how we fund our criminal justice system, right? The conditions that people endure when they can't afford to pay. But I also wanted to turn to you, Kenneth, to talk about, you know, what role do the DAs play in this, and maybe in the bail bond system that we see kind of pre-trial. There are jurisdictions that do this differently, right?
Yeah. I mean, so this bail issue it's so perverse to me because you talk about not tying it to some assessment of danger or to flight actually really undermines public safety because it gives the most dangerous criminals a dollar amount that if I can come up with that money, I can get back on the street. And that happens all the time in the city of New Orleans. But that's just a side note. Graham's already talked a little bit about the oversized impact and influence that prosecutors have in our criminal justice system. We started out with the question around what could be the most impactful thing that we could maybe change in the next 3 years in terms of impacting incarceration rates or any number of aspects of our criminal justice system. It's probably electing the right district attorneys where we live. It's probably the thing that we all could probably galvanize our resources around and making sure that we elect district attorneys that are not implementing and wedded to dinosaur tactics and concepts around criminal justice and actually have some progressive thoughts around how to preserve public safety while protecting the public trust. Right now, and this is, again, without being overly critical. I mean, this is all part of the public discourse, but when you undermine the public trust in the work of prosecutors by issuing fake subpoenas to witnesses, right? A recent study of those subpoenas in Orleans Parish found that 25 of the victims that received those subpoenas ended up being incarcerated longer than the assailants in those cases, right? You have a district attorney right now who is not just supporting the recording of phone calls between defendants and their attorneys, but actually utilizing them during the prosecution of cases, right? That is an unheard of practice across this country, but it's happening right now in the city of New Orleans. What we have right now in terms of prosecutors, and this is not just limited to state prosecutors, this is also with federal prosecutors like myself, we have so much influence, but it is the area of the criminal justice system that we know the least about. You don't really know how decisions are made within those offices. You have no data that's published. I can tell you right now, we don't even collect the data. Right now, there's only been one or two district attorney's offices, I think of Manhattan DA's office in particular, that's actually done an extensive study of the role of race and how it is playing out in every important material decision that's made in the DA's office. So everything from charging to arrests, to who gets detained, who gets bail, who gets a plea offer, what kind of plea offers they get, who goes to trial, what happens at sentence, what happens post-conviction. At each and every one of those points, there's data to be collected to better understand exactly what's happening behind the closed doors of our prosecutors' offices right now. That's where we need to go towards in order to really help improve this system.
Thank you. So what I'd like us to kind of pivot towards, and I think you set us up for this beautifully, is thinking about transparency, right, and what happens in the system, and collecting the data, is I'd like us to kind of close out with this last question, and hopefully, I've been told that we can go to 3:35, and I'm going to take every minute of it. Hopefully, just for about 5 to 7 minutes, so that we can leave some time for Q&A, I want us to talk about this issue of non-unanimous juries, because it really brings together a lot of the different threads that we've been talking about, and it's an issue that is squarely in front of us through November. And so, you know, in 2018, this session, the legislature passed a possible constitutional amendment if it is approved by the voters. And it would eliminate non-unanimous juries, meaning that it no longer would a vote of 10-2 be sufficient to convict you of a felony. So just briefly, and maybe John, you could start us off on this, can you tell us about non-unanimous juries and what that history, and maybe we can think about what that impact is and where we go from here, and how do we actually support criminal justice reform for this one area?
Well, I did a little research, and you're going to be shocked, as I'm sure everyone here will be, to find out that it has a racist history.
Oh.
Yeah, glad everyone's sitting down. And I don't mean to make light of that, but you know, really going back to lunch with House Bill 265, the right to vote, it all really the common thread across this nation's history is the right to vote. How important that is and could be and should be, and that was the impetus behind the Constitutional Convention of 1898, which allowed convictions on a rate of 9 people could send someone to jail for the rest of their life. 3 dissenting votes could be overridden. And that was so that they could purge African Americans from the ranks of the voters. Because remember, after the Civil War, you had Reconstruction, and then you had the white people called it redemption, the backlash, you know, the Empire striking back against that. And there were some Supreme Court decisions that you couldn't get around. So you couldn't just, the white majority couldn't just say black people can't vote. They had to get very creative, and so this is one of their mechanisms, thinking that they could, you know, that you could still allow a couple African American jurors, and you still get over their votes, but if you had a threshold of 9, then you would be able to still take someone, send them away to prison, take away their voting rights, and you'd have fewer blockages in your path to power to put your white supremacist views up there. And that was in the call for the Constitution, by the way. the Constitution of 1898, the call was how, I don't have the exact, it's in my phone, but the exact verbiage was to maintain the supremacy of the white race. In the 1973 Constitutional Convention, they went at it again, and obviously, or actually, interestingly, they didn't, I think it was just that elephant in the room, they didn't talk about it, but they upped it to 10. Instead of making it unanimous, they didn't preserve it at 9, but they upped it to 10, avoiding the topic of race altogether, which is really odd if you think about early 70s, Louisiana, still civil rights era. And so hopefully in November, we will, close a chapter on at least this aspect of, racial discrimination in the state.
Right, and we're one of 2 states that allows it non-unanimous juries in the United States, Louisiana being one. So what's the practical impact, Graham, of non-unanimous juries? I mean, you were a judge for a couple months. You might have seen
the practical impact is it's easier to convict people. I was asked at one point whether or not, when I was a DA, I'd ever seen prosecutors actually upcharge. So what you need to understand is you can go to a felony trial in 2 different ways. If the potential sentence, because we talked about this crazy compilation of sentences that exist in Louisiana, is without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence, then you get a jury of 12. If you have the possibility, with or without hard labor, you get a jury of 6. If you go to trial with a jury of 6, it has to be unanimous. If you go to trial with a jury of 12, it doesn't have to be unanimous. They only need 10 out of 12. So the question that was asked to me was, did I ever witness a point in time where DAs actually upped the charge to a more serious offense so they wouldn't have to get a unanimous verdict? And I can't say I specifically know that the final decision was made to do that, but I can definitely tell you the conversation was had. So what you actually saw were prosecutors saying, we're going to put someone on trial for something that maybe we don't believe in as much as the initial offense, because it's going to be easier to get the conviction. There's a recognition in the office that it's easier to convict people with the 10 to 2. And again, you see that play out. We have the highest incarceration rate on the planet. What's interesting is one of the arguments that has been made in support of the 10 to 2 is that you can actually get acquitted with the 10 to 2. So this has a dual benefit. Not only does it help the prosecutor, it also helps you, the defendant, as opposed to getting a hung jury. You can actually go home if only 10 out of the 12 think that you're innocent. What's interesting, as a prosecutor, as a judge, as a defense attorney, I have never seen a 10 to 2 acquittal, ever. If it's an acquittal, it's 12-0. I've never seen an 11-1 acquittal. I've never seen a 10 to 2 acquittal. So that argument has never made sense to me in my experience. But I've seen lots and lots of 10 to 2 convictions, 11-1 convictions. And in the end, it's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If 1 or 2 people says, I don't believe this, that's reasonable doubt. And again, the results speak for themselves.
So Mercedes, can you tell us about the energy and plans to actually get this in front of the voters and to push this issue forward? Because it could be historical, right?
Yes. And what I think is important about this issue, because I actually was, as we were getting to this question, I was thinking we haven't talked about race as much as I think maybe we should be, right? Because whenever you're talking about criminal justice in Louisiana, you have to talk about race. And what I like about this issue in a lot of ways is it exposes the raw racism behind the system in a way that you can't hide from. Because as John mentioned, the call to create this law was to preserve white supremacy. And that is on paper, and that is what happened. And no one can deny that. Other times people try to put a veneer of, it isn't racist, it just has a racist effect, or however they want to justify it, that's fine. But here we have to confront the racism of this law. And we are building a coalition. Several people here are involved in that coalition to come together to create a campaign to end this racist practice in our state. Outside we have a table, Promise of Justice Initiative. You can sign up there if you're interested in being involved. We have a one-pager on the issue. We have a Facebook group. We also have some information about a coalition here around the Baton Rouge jail, so I'll just say that now. But we're going to be building a coalition, and we are going to have a very serious ground game, and we are really going to get out there and knock on doors and talk to people and have these really important conversations around what kind of state we want to be and what kind of practices we want to be preserving. And I think it is an issue that we can be proud to really talk about and get people out to vote in November.
I mean, this is a winnable issue. And the impact on criminal cases, I mean, we can't even start to fathom how this could change the game for criminal convictions going forward here in Louisiana. And we have the opportunity to do this in November. So with all of that, and there's so much that has not been said and discussed around criminal justice reform, I wanted to give an option to anybody who wanted to ask a question, because we have such an amazing resource here. Yeah.
I have a question about decriminalization of marijuana and how that would impact the justice system, and not only the taxation of it, improve our education system and fund things that we don't have money for here in the state. I'd like to know y'all's thoughts on that.
Progressive question.
Sorry.
I mean, are you asking whether or not we agree with it, or whether or
Well,
not we think
no,
it's
no,
gonna
no.
happen?
Like, what are the? I guess what are the impacts on? I guess the justice system. Is that something that we want to pursue or fight for in Louisiana?
Well, that goes back to my funding comment before. If you want to tax marijuana, then you're expecting the government to fund the criminal justice system on the front end. What happens now is marijuana is illegal, and then someone's convicted, and then the court gets to directly issue fines and fees, and it gets the money that way. So the criminal justice system, I'm all for legalizing marijuana, whatever that's worth. But the criminal justice system would need to be funded on the front end, because it would lose all of those convictions, and it wouldn't then be able to issue its fines and fees in order to fund itself. Would be the first issue. We'd really have to rethink the culture and rethink how we are funding criminal justice. The biggest hurdle that you're going to find in that is marijuana forms the basis of probable cause in probably 60% of every arrest. You smell marijuana, you see marijuana in plants. It's so prevalent in society. It allows for so many arrests. You're going to get a real resistance from law enforcement, not because they have any issues probably with marijuana as a drug or a narcotic, but simply because their job gets harder. It gets harder to arrest people without probable cause when the plain smell of marijuana isn't giving you the ability to arrest them in the first place.
And I think, to be clear on this issue, in New Orleans, where I live, smoking marijuana, if you're a white person, is essentially legal, right? What we really criminalize is when African Americans smoke marijuana. That's what is illegal in New Orleans, and I think we have to be very clear on that.
Yeah.
It is like, I'm originally from Denver, and I go home frequently, and it's absolutely see my parents. No, but it's another thing that really exposes everything about, because you go home and they're like Starbucks, just all these shops, and people go into them and buy marijuana and come out and then hit the pet store, the drug store, the grocery store on the way home, and it's just something they do or they don't do, and just that's just it's just another part of the consumer landscape. In here, it exposes what we do that for. It's like to throw people into this money-making machine that is our criminal justice system. And as more and more states do the legalization, as they're going to do and as they are doing, we're just going to be sitting here on the sidelines saying, nope, we're all right to keep putting people into this conveyor belt. And it's a matter of when, not if. But if we're seeing the results in other states, what are we waiting for?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a little more cynical.
Thank you all for what you do. Thank you for sharing that with us. My question goes to, and I got a real concern, okay, it's constitutional, we have to go to the people. And I'm terribly afraid, I mean, you talk about, surveys of how people are feeling, but by the time this is over, I'm really hoping the people of Louisiana vote the right way. I generally don't want the folks that are in the legislature now to open the Constitution, because they don't have their heads right on this and so many other issues. But that is my concern. So I was glad to hear you say you've got a program to do this. How do you feel about, are the people of Louisiana really going to get out and vote for this? And it just kind of scares me. Until we get to the point where it passes, I think there's a lot of, is there any concern that it might not?
Work to be done, yeah.
Yeah, I will say this, I believe the district attorneys just voted in support of unanimous. The Republican Party,
yeah.
sorry, just voted in favor of eliminating non-unanimous juries.
The Republican
The
Party.
Republican Party.
Louisiana Republic GOP today passed the endorsement of.
Yeah, because essentially the Republican Party has come out on our side on the non-unanimous juries, which is huge. It's huge. And I really
It's a high
encourage
polling issue.
everybody to watch the video of when this went on the House floor. And you had Chairman Mack, who's an incredibly conservative Republican, advocating for this bill. I do think it is an issue where if you are going to be against it, and the district attorney for Calcasieu has decided that he is going to be against it and come out publicly against it, you are going to have to contend with being called, I think accurately, a racist. And I think in a way that even the cynical members of the legislature are uncomfortable with. So I am very optimistic. I'm not saying that there isn't work to be done. We have two folks in the room who are going to, I think essentially it's going to be their full-time job. We are really going to try to pull whatever resources we can to put behind it. And I think, that's not going to be the universe of it, but I think we're working really hard and fast to galvanize as many people around this issue as we can, because of course, if the voters go the wrong way, it would be devastating.
And I would dare say that the theme around race is a powerful one, but even labeling them as un-American, when you've got founding father John Adams, who in early writings actually declared unanimous juries as being a bedrock of our criminal justice system. I mean, that type of literature often resonates with conservative crowds as well.
Yeah, and the libertarian wings, this is a government overreach issue that I think people can identify with across the spectrum.
And it's the statewide issue. So this fight is not just happening in New Orleans or Baton Rouge, but it's going to be happening across the state, and we would love for you to get involved in whichever way you can. So with that, our time is at an end, but I'd love for you to join me in thanking our panelists.